who has to live with Ohio State whooping on Penn State every single season, it got me thinking, where is Ohio State right now in terms of their 2025 campaign? I mean, obviously they got over the big hump. They won the national title. They took care of business versus Notre Dame. And now they're in a unique situation. I mean, I've seen a lot of columnists kind of make this Ohio State comparison to the Michigan comparison in the sense that they're going to take a step back. They're losing this, that, or the other. I mean, obviously they're losing some big players, right? I mean, we can talk about Travion Henderson. We can talk about Junkins. We can talk about Will Howard. We can talk about Abuka. I mean, we could talk about all these different guys, right? But at the same time, too, Ohio State is such an elite program that they're just not in the situation where you necessarily have to worry about that every year. They're just gonna plug in new guys and just fill the voids where they have to. Because at the end of the day, Ohio State hasn't had 3 losses since 2011, and that was the season where Luke Fickell was their interim coach, and they went 6-7 that year, and that was almost 15 years ago now. And now you kind of sit there and realize too, for the most part, Ohio State, they're pretty consistent in terms of top 5 recruiting classes, getting 5-star recruits, and doing pretty well in the transfer portal. They brought in Julian Sayin, who is a 5-star recruit, transfer from Alabama, and by all accounts, he should be the starter. And I would definitely say he's probably is the best quarterback they have on the roster. He was ranked 8th overall in the 2024 class. And quite frankly, he's a guy that I think you can legitimately build a program around. And granted, too, especially in this day and age of college football, the incoming freshmen are not necessarily getting, underclassmen in particular, not getting as much love as they used to. Now it's such a, plug and play type of, hey, you got to have a guy who started for a bunch of seasons, or, oh, you got to have a kid from this school or whatever it is. But I think it's really cool that Ohio State decided to go in that direction too. And I think he's going to do a pretty solid job at what Ohio State is trying to do in terms of offensively speaking. And that's probably one of the biggest questions that you have for them going into 2025. Obviously, they promoted Brian Hartline, who has, been a coach on this staff for a long time. You also have Ryan Day in there too. So it kind of makes you wonder in some regard, how much influence does Brian Hartline really have over this offense? Because yes, he is the offensive coordinator, but at the same time too, you have to imagine that Ryan Day's fingerprints are going to be all over this offense. Because I go back and think to myself, Chip Kelly, Chip Kelly did exactly what he said he was going to, which was he's going to come in, he's going to implement his offense, he's going to maximize Will Howard, he's going to maximize that wide receiving core and bring in everything just enough for them to win a national title. And now he just left for the Oakland Raiders, going with Pete Carroll, which, hey, that makes sense. He doesn't know the school anything. They just won a national title, and he gets a little bit of a pay raise. So, I mean, good for him, right? But now that we're here, you kind of look at Ryan Day's, coaching history too. Obviously, he's been head coach since 2019, 70 wins, 10 losses overall. And, his relationship with Chip Kelly even goes back to 2016 when he was the quarterbacks coach with Chip Kelly in his lone 49er season. So you kind of sit there and ask yourself, okay, how's the offense going to look different? I would say first and foremost, I think it's going to be a little more balanced this year. I don't think we're going to have to sit there and expect Julian Sayin to throw for 300 yards and 4 touchdowns every game. But I do think they're going to have to find a balance to ease into it a little bit. Now, granted, Brian Hartline has never really called plays on a collegiate level before. And granted, that is a reasonable amount of skepticism at the same time too. But when you have the talent that you have at Ohio State and you sit down and you look at the schedule, I think there's more reason to be optimistic than kind of what these other columnists are saying. I mean, I've heard columnists sit there and say that they might push back to 8 or 9 wins this season. And quite frankly, I think that's a bit of a stretch in the sense of I anticipate this being closer to a 10 or 11 win team, and their only loss likely either being Penn State or Michigan. Now, granted, would I love to see Penn State beat Ohio State? Absolutely, especially now that they're going to be in Happy Valley this year. But at the same time, too, every single time that I've ever said that, I have been proven wrong time and time again. So I'm never going to go on this show and declare that anymore, because the last 3 times I've tried to declare that on this show, the exact opposite has happened. So now we're kind of reflecting on Ohio State's schedule now. And, for the most part, they avoid a lot of the tougher teams within the Big Ten. I mean, you sit there, I say to myself, the immediate teams that come to mind, you avoid Michigan State, you avoid Iowa, who, regardless of what the critics at Iowa will say in terms of Kurt Ferentz and how he's outdated and all this, that, or the other, Iowa is always a tough school to play. I don't care if you're home, away, whatever. They're one of the top 10 defenses in the country, and they are the real freaking deal. So now that you don't have to play Iowa, you don't have to play USC, and most importantly, you don't have to play Oregon. Not having to play those 4 teams, I think, is definitely going to be a big confidence booster for them. Because even when I look at the schedule, I mean, the 2 games that I have circled on my calendar is October 11th, when they have to go to Champaign, Illinois, to take on Brett Bielema's team, who I would argue is one of the better defensive teams in the country, well coached, physical, disciplined, and just an all-around gritty team. And I think that's somebody that I think you always have to be a little bit worried about. Now, granted, Illinois, I mean, they even played Penn State tough last year too, and they've definitely put themselves in a position where I think they're ready to make some noise, and I'm definitely kind of fascinated to see how that game turns out. But even when you go further into the schedule, I say to myself too, hey, having to travel to Washington isn't that ideal. I think Jed Fish is definitely building something there, even though it's going to take a season or 2 to really put that together. But most importantly, the biggest conversation about Ohio State is going to be this Michigan game again. Now, granted, they've been 1-4 the past 5 times they played them, and in order for, obviously, even if Ryan Day loses to Michigan, right, having that national championship win, that definitely alleviates the immediate pressure in the sense too. But I would say too, there definitely needs to be a conversation about Ryan Day taking care of business versus Michigan, because it's more of the symbolic sense for me more than anything. I mean, yes, he won a national title. Hey, if he walked to the sunset and retired tomorrow, he wouldn't owe the school anything, right? But at the same time, too, you have to ask yourself, too, that's going to be part of your legacy, at least to some degree. Because granted, it's always at the end of the season, too, because we can even sit there hypothetically and say, what if the only game that they lose this year is week 1 versus Texas, and then they sweep through until they get to Michigan, and then they end up 10-2. On paper, that's really not bad, considering, like, hey, I don't think the Texas game is that big of a deal, because, okay, if best case scenario is, let's say Texas travels to Ohio State puts on a complete whooping, Julian Sayin balls out and does his thing, and then they coast through the rest of the season, they take care of Penn State, they take care of Illinois, and then they lose to Michigan. That 11-1 is going to be such an eyesore for a lot of fans, including myself, that I think those conversations or narratives are going to keep on happening again, even though they just won the national title this year, which, again, I'm not creating a narrative here. We're just spitballing, obviously. And then worst case scenario, in my opinion, for Ohio State is if you replicate some sort of equivalent to what Michigan had in terms of the kind of fallback. Now, granted, with Michigan, it was a little bit different because you lost Jim Harbaugh. There were definitely some sanctions going on in the background and just a lot of different moving parts in terms of, getting in that coaching staff, being able to put all those things together. And quite frankly, most importantly, they had no quarterback too. That never helps at all as well. But I'd say worst case scenario, if you're Ohio State, I would sit there and say to myself, well, let's say you lose the Texas game, which isn't the end of the world, obviously. Let's say you lose, one of those mid games. Maybe you lose to a Minnesota, or maybe you lose to a Wisconsin, who, by the way, I think are both going to be teams who improve this year. But at the same time, too, if let's say you lose one of those games, obviously any worst scenario is going to be losing to Michigan. That's going to be the game that I think everyone's going to kind of be talking about too. But it's going to be that middle. It's going to be that middle stretch too, because the 11th you have Illinois, the 18th you have Wisconsin, and then November 1st you got Penn State. I think that's going to be the big 3-game stretch where, as a fan, I'm going to be sitting there saying to myself, how's Ohio State really looking right now too? And most importantly, the other big question that you have too is on the defensive side of the ball, where they bring in Matt Patricia, who has a plethora of experience as a head coach with the Detroit Lions, obviously, and that how that kind of fizzled out. He's been a defensive coordinator, a number of different stops. Most recently, he was a defensive assistant for the Philadelphia Eagles. So his resume speaks for himself, right? And we've seen other teams bring in a NFL type of caliber guy and bring in mixed results. I mean, I think of Wink Martindale over at Michigan. I think that turns out just fine. And at the same time, too, I think a lot of times people tend to, exacerbate this whole narrative of, oh, he's never been a college coach before. That's obviously not going to translate. And at the end of the day, football is football. Now, granted, there's always going to be differences between the college game and the NFL game. And I'm not saying that you just plug and play and that's it. But at the same time, too, at the most, you're asking Matt Patricia to call some plays, bring this defense together and get the most out of Caleb Downs, that secondary, and one of the better defensive lines in the entire country. That's really what you're asking for, is be able to build off of last season that Jim Knowles has had, building off that foundation and being able to carry off, jump off and lift from there and be able to take care of business like they have for the past couple seasons. Obviously, I think the intrigue is definitely there. I would sit there and say to myself too, obviously losing Jim Knowles is a big deal. And quite frankly, I mean, I think Jim Knowles has a very nice payday at Penn State. And, maybe he just wants to stick it to Penn State, or wants to stick it to Ohio State. Maybe he's sitting there asking himself, hey, I want to try something different. Or, hey, maybe he didn't feel as appreciated on the Ryan Day staff as we could have thought. But at the same time, I do think Matt Patricia ultimately is going to be a good hire. But at the same time, too, I think there should be a healthy amount of skepticism, given that, how's Patricia going to be like recruiting, I think is going to be the big thing, right? He's not the most personable guy. He's not the most charismatic guy. I'm never going to sit there and question his X's and O's, but it's more of how is his style going to translate to the college game that is ever more evolving into the pros. So maybe it's not that big of a deal, but at this day and age of recruiting as well, maybe it's not that big of a deal, because even if I said my last stat before, they haven't had three or more losses since 2011, and they're consistently in the top 5, top 10 every single year of recruiting. So what the heck am I talking about anyway? They've had 25 plus recruits to the 2025 class, so they're well taken care of in practically every step of the roster. So let me know what you guys think about Ohio State football going into 2025. Obviously, an early preview, but I think there's definitely a lot to be confident about, a lot to be optimistic about, and a lot of this negative chatter that you're hearing are comparisons to Michigan that, quite frankly, I would say are definitely unwarranted to a huge degree, by and large, because Michigan was dealing with a hell of a lot more than Ohio State is right now. I mean, at best, Ohio State, they're losing some players to the NFL, which they do every year, and replacing a couple coordinators. So